in John Worne, CEO of CIOL. In this presentation, John is going to give us an overview as to why all language learning, even when you already speak more than one language, is such a great investment for life. John, thank you so much for standing in last minute. How are you today?
Yeah, very good. Not a problem, Dom. A pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Okay, well, we will go straight in and pass over the controls, and you may begin your presentation.
Excellent. Right.
Okay,
So
perfect.
how's that showing? Is that okay?
That's perfect. Yeah.
Great stuff. So today's topic, valuing, using, and improving your languages, and of course, why one language is never enough. So I'm here today to talk to you about a topic that's close to the heart of all linguists, the joys and frustrations of language learning, but also I'd like to make the case for lifelong learning of languages and indeed adding more languages to your repertoire all the time, even if in some of them, you may not ever get to a particularly high standard because all linguistic ability and all languages are worth exploring and learning. And most of all, of course, and no one on this call or on this session is going to need much persuading of this, but I would want to stress that only speaking English isn't enough, that Anglophone countries in particular need to do more and need languages more than anywhere else, and that we all have a job to do in making the case for languages based on our own positive experiences of the delights that come with them. So as Dom said, I'm John Worne. I'm Chief Executive of the Chartered Institute of Linguists, and my connections with languages. I was Director of Strategy for many years at the British Council, which is the UK's international organisation for educational and cultural relations. I worked in international businesses for over a decade, in UK government, in the centre of UK government, and also in a couple of major UK universities. And all of those roles had big connections with international work. I've personally lived and worked in Europe, Southeast Asia, and South America. I'm a graduate of the University of Oxford, and I have professional working level French, improving Italian, some Spanish, learnt on the hoof in Latin America, and I'm learning Japanese, Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, and I'm working on my German as well. So I'm seeking to live the dream here. So as the Chartered Institute of Linguists, you know all this, we're the UK's Royal Charter body for language professionals and linguists. We provide qualifications and membership, and we're all about promoting the value of languages. So basically all of our members, and I guess most delegates today, will have a good command of 2 or more languages, usually English and at least one other language. And this makes them special. This makes you all very special. But as we'll see in a moment, not necessarily rare in world terms. So let's move on to regrets. And regrets, we've probably all had a few because as we go through life, many people who speak English and who live in Anglophone countries often find themselves regretting not continuing with or keeping up with languages that they learnt at home, at school, or at university, or in their previous lives. So it's a bit like not keeping up with music lessons, which many people regret, and other great starts that we had in life and didn't continue with. So it's really, really important that that we all keep and keep working on and maintaining our languages. And of course, this is exacerbated in Anglophone countries by many people who have achieved a good standard in languages other than English, still shy away from using them in their work and revert to English very often as a standard language that they're using most of the time. So what I'd like to explore in this presentation is the value for people and their employers in using and improving more languages. Because of course, not least in today's world with all of the wide range of digital resources, apps, online learning, and of course courses, language learning has never been more accessible or possible than it is today. So let's start with the bad news. Why don't more people develop and learn languages? And the truth of the matter is that it takes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours to learn a new language. And this is the reality that we need to be honest about. The good news is, of course, that anyone who is exposed to languages for a long period of time will generally, if they don't have a cognitive disability, will generally develop some competence in it. So we absorb languages very naturally. It's a natural gift for humans. But the problem is that it does take hundreds and hundreds of hours. So it's a little bit like the key insight from Malcolm Gladwell's often repeated book around the 10,000 hours thesis, that to achieve mastery in most things in human affairs, you do need to put in quite a lot of hours of work into it. Now, of course, that's not to say that there aren't people who don't have a natural affinity for languages. Some people just seem to soak them up more easily than others, and many people have really, really impressive capabilities in learning them, not least people in this webinar. But a lot of it is to do with exposure and whether you've been fortunate enough to have a bilingual or multilingual upbringing, or have had family circumstances, or simple facts of geography in terms of where you grew up and whether you were close to linguistic borders. So if we look at the global spread of linguists, basically more people in the world are bilingual than monolingual. So slightly over 50% of people are bilingual. But what's interesting is that not that many are truly multilingual. So it's probably only about 1 or 2% of people who are truly genuinely multilingual. So I think this tells you something about how exposure makes all the difference. And of course, back to that 10,000 hours rule, hundreds and hundreds of hours, it would be quite difficult to achieve fluency and be a polyglot because that's a lot of hours to fit in. So if you've had the good fortune to grow up with languages in your life, then you're off to a flying start. But if not, and you learn, for example, in school, this is an illustration of why so many school children, particularly in Anglophone countries, struggle a little bit with their languages. In the UK today, if you're very lucky, you might get 450 hours of exposure to languages if you took languages to GCSE, and many pupils would get less than that. And that's pretty much a constant because there's research back to the 1990s which said that that was around about the level of hours that people will get exposed to in the UK school. And if you compare that to major European countries and the exposure that pupils would get to English, they get much more exposure, both through classroom learning, but also in terms of consumption of media and the other ways in which English gets into their lives. So if I was to compare that, for example, my progress in French at school wasn't amazing. I dropped it at the first possible opportunity. So I assumed that I had no linguistic capabilities whatsoever, and I was a bad linguist. But living and working in France, of course, simple exposure does the job. So by my calculation, working in France for 5 years, I probably clocked up at least 30,000 hours of exposure to French, and quite naturally, as we'll all have had on this call, the language starts to drop in through simple immersion and exposure. So basically, the question really is, how can we get more hours and more exposure into people? One of the big problems, of course, in our linguistic lives, particularly in Anglophone countries, is the notion of fluency, the idea that there is a perfect speaker of a language out there, and that until we achieve that level of perfection and we achieve the famous term fluent, then actually our languages are not worth using. And of course, this is absolutely not the case. Languages at all levels are highly valuable, but many people in Anglophone countries do believe and have reinforced by their experiences the notion that they need to be absolutely fluent before they can start speaking. So when you combine the hundreds of hours problem with the I daren't use it unless I'm fluent problem, then you have what we get in many Anglophone countries, which is people with perfectly usable language skills, perfectly functional language skills that would, of course, improve if they use them, who shy away from any kind of usage. So what we've got to try to encourage is get people used to the fact that a few missteps, some grammatical errors, and possibly being slightly accented isn't a problem. That we need to really encourage people who have language skills to try to use them and not be dominated by the use of English worldwide. So just to bring this into slightly sharper focus, let's take a look at the classic framework for language competence, which is the Common European Framework of Reference, which was designed over 30 years ago to bring a common understanding across all European countries of linguistic standards and linguistic levels. And of course, the CEFR absolutely recognises the value of basic skills, A1 and A2, which are the sorts of skills that could be quite useful in a visit, in a trip to a country, then getting up to a level of independent use, B1, B2. That's probably where my Italian is these days, which means that I can have a much more confident engagement with someone from Italy or go and travel there. And then up at the levels that many people on this call will be C1 and C2, which are the levels where you have a professional capability and can work in a language. So really important to separate out and tease out the fact that there are these different levels of linguistic capability, and the fact that all of them are useful, and that with more exposure and with more practice, people will progress through these levels. And of course, the way we talk about linguistic levels in the UK doesn't really very often talk about the CEFR and the actual functional use of languages. Other countries and other educational systems are much more upfront about practical use. So, how long might it take to progress from the CEFR through the CEFR? Well, of course, this will vary enormously from individual to individual, the nature of your learning style, the amount of your exposure, but certainly we're talking 100 to 150 hours of basic learning to get through each step. And the last steps, B2, C1, are the hardest of all. So no one should underestimate the value of the skills that we all have on this call. B2 and C1 and C2 skills are incredibly valuable and incredibly hard to get. But the fact of the matter is that if you put in the hours, you will progress. So I think it's a very important thing to get across to people that progress can be made. So what difference does it make? I think I would say, and I'm sure we would all agree, that it makes all the difference in the world, because if a person has A-level, A1 and A2 level skills, they can certainly get themselves out of difficult situations in another country. And once you start to get into the independent level, B1 and B2, then people have a range of vocabulary and ability to express themselves, of course with some mistakes and circumlocutions, but they're able to basically engage and at B2 levels give a viewpoint, provide some pointers to people, and properly engage. And certainly when you're getting to B2 levels of language, then you're starting to get to the point where potentially in a professional context they can do a job for you in certain circumstances. Of course, C1 is what we're looking for, and that's the standard that we look for membership for CIOL. But nevertheless, B1 and B2 are well worth celebrating because they're useful levels of skill. And again, to repeat, with more and more practice, people will advance. So, what to do? Well, basically, if we have any language skills in our memory banks from school, from life experiences, then it's really important to dust off those memory banks and restore that knowledge and keep it fresh, and seek every possible opportunity to speak and improve your languages. And this is really important because there is a thing, as you will know, called language attrition, which basically says if you don't use it, you lose it. So although languages can be restored, confidence dips and also actual ability dips with time. So very important to dust off the memory banks and bring back those languages that you may have had either through family, school, or other experiences. The second thing is I would advocate for improving your languages every single day. Certainly I do. There are, of course, wonderful courses and wonderful facilities available in many universities, lots and lots of online resources. But I would just give a shout out for apps. The Duolingo app, which is the one that I use most of all, I use that daily. I've an uninterrupted streak of over 5 years now, and I do half an hour of at least one language every day. And just slowly, very slowly, it drops in and becomes available to you. So my Italian's now okay. I have a long way to go in Japanese and Chinese, but I'm confident we'll get there. Probably if you invite me back in 10-15 years with even less hair than I have now, I'll be able to give you more Chinese and Japanese. I would also mention Memrise, which is absolutely excellent if you're about to go and visit a country. Really, really good to brush up on just the sorts of conversational skills that you might need in a basic visit to a country with the language that you're not used to. And of course, the great things about these apps is if you do have hundreds or thousands of hours in your locker, then these apps can restore them. So I would say my French was getting very rusty. Duolingo brought it back and also brought back my confidence. So I do think there's a lot to be said for a daily regimen of practicing your languages. So why bother? And I don't think anyone on this webinar is going to really need persuading of this, but it's clear that personally and professionally, people always react positively to someone who shows an interest in their language. This is me in Beijing some years ago. What a difference it would have made if I'd been able to understand and converse a little bit in Mandarin, which now I could probably do. So at that time I couldn't, so I'm left smiling and depending on an interpreter. But these days, I would at least be able to understand the basics, pleasantries, and probably pick up quite a lot of what was being said. So, so much better if you've got a little bit of the language. And then, of course, the cultural and life benefits. Again, in Beijing, I was totally dependent on other people to take me around and show me things. I'd be much more confident now to beat my own track if I went back because of a little bit of language. Same for Tokyo and Japan. And then avoiding the very real costs of monolingualism and feeling alone. And basically, as we know, the problem for someone who is monolingual is they will have a reduced understanding of their own culture, as well as obviously the cultures of other people. They'll be greatly restricted in their ability to get the best out of visiting other countries. They'll incur additional expense. They'll have high dependency on others. And basically, as I was saying about Chinese and Japanese, any ability in language, even a very, very low ability, gives you more independence and more capacity to be confident and beat your own trail. But of course, everyone on this call will know this. What we also offer these days is CIOL language level assessments. So these are brief oral assessments where you speak to an assessor and they will feed back to you what your current level of language proficiency is with respect to the CEFR. I think that's really useful because you can see where you're at and also you can set yourself a target for where you'd like to get to. They're comparatively inexpensive and a very, very useful way of establishing what your language levels are. And we offer them in all languages. We've done them in Yiddish, in Hebrew. We've done them in pretty much every language you can think of. So if you're pursuing and adding a language to your portfolio, then language level assessments are a really good way to build on that. But the fundamental point that I'm hoping to persuade you of, and I'm hoping you need very little persuading of, is keep putting in the hours. But perhaps what I would advocate for as well is keep learning more languages. Certainly what I found is that the more languages I set about, and I've had to go Esperanto, Romanian, lots and lots of different languages, is that every language brings a new appreciation, some new peculiarities, and basically the more of them you study, in a strange way, the ones you have start to develop. It's like physical exercise. It stretches the brain and stretches your understanding and your appreciation of what an amazing thing languages are. They are the quintessentially human capability. So whether you're waiting for the kettle to boil or on a commute or just sat with a bit of time on a mobile phone, it really is amazing how you can clock up the hours if you put your mind to it. And start to progress, albeit slowly but surely, in new languages. And if there were any doubt as to the benefits of doing this, whatever stage you are in your life, then for many years, since at least 20 years ago, the first research studies came out that suggested that languages, that bilinguals and people with more languages have a certain amount of resilience and a certain amount of resistance to the onset of dementia. The latest article on that I was reading in February, which again reinforces this point. It's just basically amazing exercise for the brain. So this is one of my favorite photos. This was a photo I took actually in Beijing in a 1,000 person IELTS exam, so 1,000 people proving their English level in a university in Beijing. And the fact that this poster was on a wall in China in English, quoting Nelson Mandela, I think perfectly encapsulates the ways that languages can connect cultures. Basically, if you talk to a person in a language they understand, that goes to the head. If you talk to a person in their own language, that goes straight to their heart. So my advocacy today would be to say, please never ever give up on maintaining, improving, and adding to and learning more languages. And I'm sure we're all agreed on that. So I think we've got a bit of time, Dom, for some poll questions, and then obviously some questions from the audience.
Absolutely. So just one moment. Okay. So our first poll question: how many languages do you speak? I'm hoping there's not going to be too many people with one, but if that applies to you, do put that down. And we're getting the votes coming in, and we're getting lots of votes coming in. So I'll keep this open for a few more seconds. Okay, just 2 seconds, and I'll close it now. So nobody with just one, 16% with two, 36% with three, 43% with 4 to 5, and 5% with 6 or more languages.
Terrific, and I think this is also interesting, and I think some of the questions that we're going to do in a moment will get into this. It's not neutral to have the term speak, because of course people have different abilities in listening, in speaking, in writing, and in reading. And very often, of course, speaking for many people who have learnt in an educational system is one of the most difficult things of all. So some people will be inhibited by the term speak, but of course, if you learn in the kind of just in normal immersion, then you're more likely to be potentially comfortable with speaking and maybe much less comfortable with reading and writing. So it's well worth noting that the way we ask the question would probably yield quite different results. Nevertheless, very encouraging that there are so many people prepared to say that they confidently speak 4 or 5 languages, and a few who are 6 or more. So that's absolutely wonderful. It'd be an interesting question for me how I would answer that one. I would probably, if you said how many languages do you speak, say 2, English and French. But if you said how many do you understand, I would probably go for certainly 4, possibly 5. So that does flag that for depending on how you've accumulated your languages, sometimes the speaking bit is one of the more difficult bits, and that is part of the reason why we made language levels assessments about oral skills, because they're the ones that arguably are the most useful to be a bit more confident about.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, we'll have our next poll question. Are you learning a new language at the moment? So, of course, the vast majority, or the majority, all of us indeed, will at least speak 2 languages here. So are we happy with that? Is that enough? Or are we learning a new language currently because we love languages? And I'll just hold this open just a little bit longer because the votes are still coming in.
Well, one of the things I noticed, Dom, when that first became available was all the people who were learning new languages pounced on it. So it immediately shot up to 90, 80 or 90. And I think that speaks to the enthusiasm and joy point that it really is a joyful business setting out on a new language. There's a sort of a magical moment in language learning when the listening goes from being sort of a blur of noise into you start to hear the spaces between the words. And I love that moment in language learning because, of course, those spaces between words don't actually exist. They're inserted by your brain, and they're not there in the reality. And that's it's an incredibly encouraging moment when you're starting or progressing in a new language, when all of a sudden you start to hear the words instead of just the noise. So I can well relate to the speed and excitement with which people pounced on the yes button. It's settled back to not far off 50-50. I guess I would personally really advocate for trying a new language. It's just as I say, a joyful business. It can be a bit frustrating in the early in the early period where you don't feel you're making that much progress. But well, as you can tell from my enthusiasm, I think it's a wonderful thing, and I'm certainly on the go with 5 at the moment. So I'd advocate for everyone having at least one that you're adding to your repertoire.
Brilliant. Okay, and we have one more question. So this is just for the 53% who said they are learning a new language currently, and what level are you aiming to achieve in your new language? Are you aiming for full fluency, the tyranny of fluency, as that came up as that came up earlier in your presentation? John, are you happy with functional? And yeah, probably not many people are aiming to reach beginner level. I've certainly reached beginner level in some of the languages I've tried to learn, but it's never the aim. So there we go. 59% functional, 41% fluent.
I think this is really tricky because I'm advocating for a functional level of language, but I would be very diffident about my Italian. And there are some days when I think, oh, I'd love to be fluent in Italian. Maybe I'll go and do an immersion course or go and live there for a month or something. So the kind of temptation of fluent, I think, is always there. But functional is really really useful. I do obviously it will vary from person to person, but I think for Chinese and Japanese, I would say functional would be the absolute pinnacle of my hopes there. Just such a long way to go with characters, pronunciation, and grammar. But I do think that functional is a noble aim. I think it's really what most people. Certainly, I think if you talk to people who have learned English as a second language, often their starting point was functional. It was just a necessary and useful thing, and fluency was the second order question. Functional, to do a purpose was the requirement.
Fantastic. Okay. So I'll close that. John, your camera does seem to have just turned off. In any case, I'm going to go through some of the questions and comments we have. Still on the subject of fluency, we have a comment here. Interesting remarks about the tyranny of fluency. In the German-speaking world, we have a dominant tyranny of speaking without an accent in schools. What are your thoughts on that? And I guess that's something we see with English as well.
Absolutely, and I do think that accents are a real issue in terms of people's self-confidence, and undoubtedly, of course, you do get picked up on your accent. So I was routinely picked up on my British accent in French, and it does kind of slightly get to you. I think that we certainly, as the Chartered Institute of Linguists, should be very positive about all different types of accents. I think the reality is for most people that you will, unless you've learnt a language or been exposed to a language in childhood, you will be accented. So I think we should embrace accents, see them as part of the joy of languages, and absolutely do what we can to avoid the tyranny of accents. And then, particularly in Anglophone countries, we need to be really, really aware the tendency to gratuitously and unnecessarily correct people on accents and indeed on minor peculiarities of speech. I think it's incredibly important to be generous, encouraging, and recognise. If somebody's got the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours which you've got them to, a reasonable level of functional capability in English, let's be positive about them. Or similarly, for someone in the German system. So I would be, generally speaking, all for different accents and being more positive about accented speech.
Very good. So the next question here, how do you overcome stagnation when you are between the B2 and C1 levels? This is very common and can be frustrating. And yes, I feel that pain as well.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely on the money. And, interestingly enough, from an assessment perspective, it's one of the most difficult things to assess. The B2C1 borderline is quite difficult to assess because a person with good B2 skills, will often have good ways of working around gaps in their grammatical or vocabulary, their mastery of vocabulary. So they've got good sort of compensating mechanisms. I think, in many ways, again, it goes back to the functional or fluent question. Clearly, if there is something that you're seeking to achieve, if you're seeking to achieve C1 for membership of the Chartered Institute of Linguists, then it's just a case of practice. It has to be a case of practice. But if you're using your languages for the joy of language endeavour, then let's be positive about B2 as well. It's an entirely useful and delightful level to achieve. So I do think that both levels are very, very useful and valid. But I completely recognise the point, as you do, Dom. Both of us talk about this a lot. The difference between the top of B2 and the bottom of C1 is hard to bridge.
Very good. Yes, indeed. So a couple of questions on learning multiple languages. So one, how many languages do you need to speak and how fluently to be considered an hyper polyglot as opposed to a polyglot? And there's also another question here just saying, don't you get confused learning so many, different, so completely different languages, so many and so completely different languages?
It's a really interesting point. I remember when I first learned Spanish, which was in a purely, feral working context. I just learnt it by being in Colombia, and then learnt French in a similarly feral way. Just learnt it purely by being in France and and working there. I found that my Spanish completely erased and jumbled my French rather completely erased and jumbled my Spanish. And I remember talking to someone who was a much, much more confident linguist than me at the British Council, who spoke 7 or 8 languages. And she said that she found that it was almost like switches on the dashboard of a car, that she found switching between languages much, much more straightforward. I found it really difficult with languages that are more closely related to each other. So certainly my French interferes with my Italian, and my French absolutely interferes with my Spanish. But I find personally, it will vary from person to person, but I find much, much less interference with languages that are further away from Romance languages. So much, much less interference between Japanese and French and Italian, for example. So, and then what I would go with is the piece of advice I was given by that better linguist, who basically just said, relax. To some extent, when the hours are put in and when the ear tunes in, the level of jumbling starts to go away. There is one other thing that I would say that works for me, bizarrely, which is to, almost in my own mind, in my own head, put on a very, very stereotypical accent. So if I want to, connect with my French, I have to go very French. Like an old boss of mine that I work with in French, and then all of a sudden the French kind of locks in. And similarly, in Italian, I have to go much, much more Italian in order for the Italian to kick in. So I do find that it's almost like your inner voice if your inner voice goes very much into the vernacular, and of course English is very flat and monosyllabic and blah 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 blah. So I find if I need to put the gear into the stick, into the slot for the Romance languages, I need a bit more energy and exuberance in my head, and then all of a sudden the Romance languages kick in. In fact, one of the interesting things that I've been told is I'm a far more engaging and entertaining person in French than I am in English. So do try me sometime. But I think that's also to do with the with the nature of the language. They're just much more energetic languages, more expressive in many ways.
Very good, very good. Um, when we say speak a language, does it apply to sign languages and not only spoken languages? To speak sign, as it were.
Well, I'm no expert on sign language, but I do have a friend of mine who has learnt it, and it's really interesting because it seems, from what I can see, very similar to my experience of spoken languages in that she just can't keep her hands still. So when she's talking, her hands just she her hands come to life, and I think this is the point where your kind of natural affinity for languages kicks in. It's almost like you can't help yourself. It's innate, and this is why I think I mean, again, different people will have different approaches, but for me, I've found that I do much better with languages when I relax into them rather than sort of strain with them. So I do think that that kind of almost getting out of your own brain's way is possibly the best. And certainly when I look at my friend who's a good signer, she's not conscious of it. It is just like it's just kind of locked into her physicality, and she does it without thought. So I think from what I can see, it looks like it's engaging the same sorts of pathways as spoken languages do.
Fantastic. There's another question here. Which language do you enjoy the most?
Oh, well, Italian these days is kind of easy. I do like Japanese. Japanese has got such a phenomenal number of loan words. It's amazing how many English words are in Japanese. So areruji, which is allergy, konbanwa. There's just so many words that you would think, wow, that's. I'm staggered that that's in the Japanese language. So. One of the things that helps multilingual and bilingual children in early years learning with languages is encountering synonyms or words that sound the same. So although Japanese is very different in many ways, it's got these great many encouraging words that pop up where they're absolutely recognizable because they're from English. So I find Japanese a delightful combination. So I would say if I had unlimited time, I'd probably spend more time on Japanese. But what I would say in answer to the question, the poll question, is all I'm ever aiming for is functional. If I could navigate the Tokyo Metro, that would be enough for me. I don't think fluency is maybe I'm not believing in my own dream here. Maybe I should aim for fluency, but functional Japanese would be something I would love to achieve.
Fantastic. I'll also answer that because Italian is my language, but I've always most enjoyed speaking Spanish in Argentina, particularly Buenos Aires, sort of Spanish with an Italian accent. That's my happiest place. We're kind of running into lunch, but we'll maybe have one more question, if I may, John, which is which grammar have you found to be the hardest in the languages you speak that you've been studying?
Again, my approach to grammar is because I learnt English grammar, or rather didn't learn English grammar in a curious period in British education where we weren't taught it. So I had no idea of English grammar and still don't. So I have the same approach to grammar that I have to vocab, which is relax into it. And all of a sudden, what I would say, and more or less there with Japanese. Getting there with Chinese is you just start to have a like a feel for where a piece of grammar is supposed to be. So Japanese does its word ordering very differently. Quite often focuses on the time up at the front rather than the subject up at the front. But my personal approach is not to try to learn it, so to speak. Just immerse yourself in it, and then I think your brain does the assembling job for you. So I do think, again, different people will have very, very different approaches. And certainly when I talk to people, for example, who've learnt languages in intensive circumstances in the armed forces, they are much, much more organised in the way they go about it. But for me, I would say absorption is the best way. And then to some extent, the curiosities of grammar just get absorbed along with the curiosities of the vocab. Probably the one that I stumble on most is German, because German has some similarities with English, so you sort of think you're on home ground, and then it's just got a totally different word order, which I always get wrong. So I would say probably maybe German, because of its proximity to English, is the grammar that is hardest to persuade myself that I need to do it the German way. But they're all fascinating because all languages do the same job, just in radically different ways.
Fantastic. Okay, well, there's more questions and comments flooding in, but we should wrap up now because we've come up to lunch and gone beyond that time. Just to say, loads of people coming in and saying how motivating they found your talk, John. So that's great to
Brilliant.
see. People saying that you've inspired them to take up another language.